Walk us through your process using Romans 12, 1 and 2 as an example.
Well, this will obviously need to be quite abbreviated with the constraints of time we have here. But the first thing I would do, if I was approaching a text of Scripture to preach expositionally from it, the first thing I would do is to pray. To pray specifically that God would direct my thinking, that He would guide my study, so that I would come to the same conclusions that He came to as He superintended the writing of it, so that I would understand what He meant. Because it's only out of that then that I can adequately preach. The second part of that prayer would be that I could communicate the text effectively to God's people. Because it's one thing for me to understand it myself, and it's quite another thing for me to share that in such a way that God's people understand not only what it means, but what they are expected to do and be because of it. And so prayer should bathe all of this process. But then the second thing I would do is I would read it. That sounds pretty obvious, but read the text in question, but also read the context. You know, if you get a letter or an email from a loved one, you don't read just one or two sentences out of that letter or email and pretend to understand the letter. And you wouldn't use those one or two sentences and try to explain to somebody else what that letter meant. And so you need to read the context. Read the whole book. Read the surrounding verses and chapters. Our text in question here in Romans chapter 12 finds us at a transition point in the book of Romans. It's important to understand that. It's important to understand where the text is in the book and what came before and what comes after. In this case, Romans 12, 1 and 2 actually forms a bridge between the first 11 chapters of the book of Romans and the last 5. And so this is a really critical text in terms of the book of Romans. In the first part of the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul wants us to know who God is. He wants us to know who we are. And he wants us to know how God has acted or how God has worked with people and with His people throughout history. In the second part of the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul is writing primarily to Christians, instructing them about how they are to live and how they are to behave and how they are to think and how do they interact with unbelievers, with those in authority, with their fellow Christians. These are all very practical questions. But those questions are all answered in the context of who God is, who we are, and how God has acted, how God has worked. And so this bridge in Romans 12, 1 and 2 forms the pivot or the hinge where this happens. And what we see here is that these verse 1 refers us back to the previous 11 chapters. And it says, I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And so he's appealing now to us as Christians, therefore, on the basis of what God has done, who God is and who we are. And he's giving us some very clear instruction about what's going to really matter. And it's important for us to get that. And so that becomes the main point of the sermon. The main point of the sermon is that this right living, in light of who God is and who we are, is going to hinge on a renewed mind, a changed mind, a changed way of thinking. That's going to be the critical point. And so that becomes the main point of the sermon. This idea of a changed mind, a renewed mind. And the supporting points of the sermon will follow the arguments of the text here. And we see this, first of all, that it is only by the mercy and power of God that we are able to have a changed mind. We see this in verse 1, chapter 12, verse 1, the first part. The second point is that this changed mind is going to require a posture of surrender and worship. We can't expect to have a changed mind if we come to God and demand that it be our way. No, we have to come to God in full surrender, in worship, if we're going to expect our minds to be changed. And we see that in the last half of verse 1. And thirdly, we see that all of this is set in contrast to the kind of the default setting of our minds being conformed to the ways of the world, the way the world works. That's the rut that we're in already. If you read back to Romans chapter 1, that's where we are. That's where the whole world is. And the only way to escape that is by the positive we find here in verse 2 of being transformed by the renewal of our minds. And then we see, in the last part of verse 2, we see the results or the application of this. The results of a transformed mind, a renewed mind, are that we will know God's will. We will be able to discern it, be able to understand it, to know it. And by knowing God's will, then we're going to live a life that's good and acceptable and complete or perfect. And so there's your outline of the sermon. It comes right from the text. The text of Scripture dictates not only what you say, but how you say it and how the sermon is organized. And so we can easily see in this passage some of those kind of qualities or marks of exposition that we talked about a few minutes ago. We see the necessity of faith. We see the necessity of a responsive obedience. The application in this sermon should be centered around the main point, the main idea, and that is the renewal of our minds. We tend to want to jump to other application that's more secondary, but the primary application should be, how are we going to get a renewed mind? How are we going to be transformed in our thinking? And how's our thinking going to be changed? Because once our thinking is changed, once our minds are renewed, then we will know what God's will is. Then we will be good, acceptable, and perfect, or complete. But let's not get the cart before the horse. Let's make sure that the renewed mind is the main focus, because that's the main focus of the text. And that's how God works. And so we see that this passage illustrates the necessity of good study, of good understanding of context, of application, of motivation. We need to understand all of these things in order to be able to communicate clearly what God has said so that people can understand it and respond in faith and obedience.